Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our forums occur most Sundays at noon, and they're free and open to the public, and we encourage you to attend. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue, and you can find out more about our forums by going to www.austinuu.org. Our mission is to nurture the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. And now one of our forum committee members, Richard Halpin, is introducing today's speaker, Ronnie Dugger. Richard, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted you're here for this remarkable speaker. In the 70s, I spent some time at a friend's house, the Ellinger's house, and I met a gentleman there named Ronnie Dugger. He was a writer, and he had a lot of good ideas, and he was a clear thinker, and he was passionate about the world we lived in, and he was a can-do person. And he liked to expose injustice, and he liked to talk about how we could have a better world. The 70s was a long time ago now, and although that time has gone by, Ronnie Dugger remains a passionate, enthusiastic, truth-telling communicator, writer, editor, publisher, a progressive journalist of the highest caliber, an extraordinary, award-winning Texas legend. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together in a warm welcome for Ronnie Dugger.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you. Good morning. I'm honored you're having me here among you. New single-member districts in the council gives us a new occasion to start again, really, in Austin. And I'll take this half hour. And the second half hour, I hope we'll have a free discussion, speak freely, make statements, because this is not just questions to me. I want to hear your new ideas. We start with the most liberal large city in Texas, the Berkeley, the Cambridge, the Colorado City of Texas. But with our constitutional right of self-government under assault from the power-grabbing and reactionary Republican governor, lieutenant governor, and legislators, who are literally undertaking to deny we, the people of Austin, the right to govern ourselves. Suddenly we face the question, may and can we govern ourselves on our rights and interests that are local? But local ain't what it used to be. I'm probably the least qualified of you here to undertake this. I was here about 20, 25 years, starting in 1947, doing the Texas Observer and so forth. And I went northeast for 28 years. Just came back three years ago. So you all know much more about Austin than I do, and I'll stand to be corrected and taught. Nevertheless, from the outside, sometimes somebody doesn't have so many connections anymore that might keep his or her mouth shut. So in my ideas, these provocations, I am sharply subject to education and correction, to your better knowledge, and to your thoughts. Cognizant that any new undertaking, idea, depends on whether it's really a need already or mostly met, would have or create new problems that may invalidate or obviate it, and has to be evaluated in the two contexts of available energies and resources and other needs and ideas with higher priorities. My, I hope, modest purpose is simply provocation, to participate in this new start for us and our potential roles here and among other Texas and U.S. cities, and new thinking about the power and roles of we, the city itself. I suggest at our outset, basal to the roots, at the roots, radical, rethinking among us here in Austin on the nature of a city, and perhaps a consciously undertaken census of the available local, state, and federal social systems and their adequacy in Austin. The very simple idea of the city as a good place, a city as an organism of successfully self-sustaining people, where we are also enhancing, as best we can, the existences of those who aren't successful, creating not a money and domination-driven place, but as best can be done, a city for the good of all. The city as a societal hospital. The city as one organism in the whole body of the nation's cities. Cities not only as people-concentrated organisms of the nations therein, but as organs of the very world of cities. A constitution for the city. For this arrived reality, we need reconceived federalism itself. Technology, including that of weaponry, has rendered obsolete our only vertical, hierarchical of the federal, then the state, then the local self-government. To defend our species, our cities, and indeed ourselves and our families, we must reconceive vertical federalism as horizontal, too. Nay, as therefore unpredictably every directional. The city is a collective undertaking of, by, and for all the people in it. My deepest personal concern, which was to be my subject today, until I realized I wasn't ready for going on even community television about it, is that the rapidly increasing likelihood of nuclear war, when realized in that war, will mean the total destruction of any and every city and all of us in it, or can mean that. The salient characteristic of H-bombs is that there is no limit on the size of the city they can vaporize. No limit at all. We're dealing with forces of the cosmos, not just the solar system. Thus make the deliverable H-bomb big enough, or enough of them in number, and Moscow, or London, or Beijing, or New York City, or Austin is gone. This gives the people in every city, for example, us in Austin, the primal, the constitutional rights to participate as primary actors in U.S. foreign and war-making policies concerning our government's, Mr. Obama's, new trillion-dollar nuclear weapons and delivery systems budget, with our money, to continue at literally rising risk, high risk, of nuclear war by accident or intention, violating the 1968 Nuclear Proliferations Treaty, solemnly signed by us, requiring the 9 nuclear nations to adopt a complete, no, the 5 original nuclear nations, to adopt a complete abolition of nuclear weapons. We have become a lying nation, and officially and publicly and relentlessly and consistently lying nation, saying that we intend to obey that treaty, which called for prompt negotiation for complete nuclear disarmament. What? It was 1968, 50, 60 years ago. Now, what's actually happened, unbeknownst probably to most of you, or even all of you, because there's been damn little publicity about it, even in the excellent Austin American Statesman. Last year in Nazaret, Mexico, on what they call the Mexican Riviera, first was in Oslo, and then was in Mexico, and recently in Vienna in December. There were 3 meetings calling every nation in the world to go together to discuss what were oddly called the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, meaning, of course, the genocidal consequences of nuclear weapons. And after the 3rd meeting in Vienna, to which 159 nations sent delegations. Did you know that? Never heard about it, did you? I think it's 138, but many more than 100 nations signed a call for a treaty abolishing nuclear weapons. The United States and the other 5 original nuclear nations boycotted the first 2 of these meetings, but France and the United States put out a message disapproving of them, alleging that we are preparing to abolish nuclear weapons at the same time that we're spending $1/3 of $1 trillion in the next 10 years to build new weapons, to what we call modernize existing weapons, to maintain them, and to build new delivery systems, as they're also doing in Russia, in England, and in every other nuclear nation. Now, this is especially aimed, this rebellion, so far ignored by the press and the nuclear nations, of the non-nuclear nations against the United States and Russia mostly, but against all the nuclear weapons nations. The heads of both states are now targets of the rest of the world. Our nation is becoming an outlaw nation, and Russia is, and every nuclear nation is, because that has signed, and that doesn't include them all, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. The President of the United States is the source of the official U.S. policy statement on nuclear weapons, which said under extreme circumstances we would use them. Putin has said that in order to advance purposes of state, he will use nuclear weapons in a war if he chooses. Those are new statements from those two countries. Of course, then when that war occurs, escalating who knows how, that will end not only the life in whatever cities are targeted, but easily life on Earth. So where do our two senators and the members of our delegation in the U.S. House stand on the President's $1 trillion budget for nuclear weapons over the next 30 years? Perhaps from all of them, we know the answer. It's not even an issue among most of them, yet there are representatives. In that kind of a context, I want to bring up the subject of the title of a book by a lawyer, a small group of us are employing to incorporate in Boston for us the Foundation for Democratic World Federation. His name is David Wiley. He wrote a book called Cities Save Thyself. So one thing that can be done, for example, provocationally proposed, would be for Austin to participate in calling a national and then a intercontinental conference of cities on the constitutional rights of cities, and I would say on the abolition of nuclear weapons first. The most basal thing we could start for cities here in Austin might be the formation by volunteers under the aegis of the new city council of new citizen task forces. Call them the Swedish model citizen study and action groups, which are all over Sweden and guarantee its democracy. The state puts up enough PIN money for the convener of whatever study group the citizens want to form up, and generally the membership is 12. They study whatever they damn well want to study. They research it, and then if they choose, they issue a report, which is made public, and then if they choose, they go into action. In my study action group, for example, I would make study and action of the Texas delegation in Congress, specifically our part of it, on nuclear weapons and wars of aggression, in which we are now well practiced, are we not? Second, on Pantex, the nuclear weapons assembly and storage factory north of Amarillo. And third, on Andrews County, which is now being proposed as the nation's recipient for all our nuclear waste, assuming that we will still be Texas here in 1 million years, protecting our citizens from stumbling into the caves and barrels of it. Other new ideas, provocations. How about a call for council inquiry, city council inquiry, to other large U.S. cities for descriptions of all their social assistance programs, all those cities' programs, especially any innovative ones, thereby constituting, drawing in other cities' participation, starting with the Texas cities, other Texas cities, which, by the way, are far more liberal. All of them, the big ones. Now, Houston is 70% minority in presidential elections than the rest of the state, thereby constituting, with other cities' participations, a large and comparable bank of things cities can do among their peoples to rival the Koch and big corporation-funded ALEC group, which is literally writing the state laws in every legislature they can penetrate with. The effect would be, obviously, digitally available in every city, the Good Cities Library. An Austin law against usury. Why not? Here we got payday thievery. We got the banks just announcing 30% penalties for being a day late, a minute late in their monthly payment of your bills schedule, producing interest rates 180%, 310%, $30 for 2 days. What's the annual rate of that? Usury now being prohibited for cities and a usury law So it's limiting everything, including, say, illegitimate fees that are actually part of interest, to 10%. Well, the reason we're not able to do that constitutionally, the corporate controlled and big bank controlled and billionaire class controlled Congress has preempted the subject from the cities and states. Well, to hell with that. That's the right attitude to what's happened to the power of cities to protect themselves in a new environment. To hell with it. Constitute, if you can, a constitutional crisis. Pass your laws that you want and see what happens. Why not repeal half and then all of the poor gutting state sales tax? Isn't it 8.25%? And a huge source of our income for state activities. Replacing it with graduated personal or corporate income taxes and wealth at the city level. We got 3 billionaires in Texas. In Austin, let's start there and see what happens. For Austin only, prohibit water by capture. That means that anybody can produce all the water he or she or it, sellers of bottled water, people who are developing along the IH-35, all the water they want to from whatever tract of land you own. Maybe your house, maybe your home. People in West Austin who've got the money are drilling all the water up from wells that they drill, and the people in West Austin and nearby who don't have the money can't. Well, I'm sure that would run into the Texas Supreme Court. Let's run into the Texas Supreme Court. Let's try some laws of our own. I mean, to hell with it. They're telling us we have to stand by for such. How about a council resolution demanding the Texas delegation act to repeal, so far as it affects us in Austin, Citizens First United, McCutcheon, and corporate personhood? I mean, let's pass a law. Some cities have done it. Let's keep doing it. Why not raise this question in Austin and provide for and protect city laws for public funding of all public elections? To deter war, I want to, and after all, how do we prevent war? We actually don't take that question seriously, but it's certainly with nuclear weapons here. But not only that, now that we're getting into robotic war fields where there are no soldiers on our side, we just got machines killing everybody. How do you prevent war? Is that a serious question? Yes, it is. And there was an idea that Drew Pearson was pushing like mad, maybe 50, 60 years ago. And he was right. It's sister cities concept. It's finding cities, the sister cities concept, and I assume that Austin has a sister city or two. I would assume so. Well, how about inventing the concept now to deter war, to make it less likely? Brothers and sisters cities, leaguing up with Dallas. I'm just postulating here for provocation. Leaguing up with Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and El Paso in our case, to establish these sister-brother cities with one big city matching them in Russia, China, Israel, Iran, and North Korea. Namely, whatever you deem to be, and those I deem to be, the nations at which we're likeliest to be at war, including nuclear war. And then you have home exchanging visits between the cities. That thing that you can now do to some extent through ARNRB, whatever the initials are. You exchange with families in your sister city in the hated nation, and you become friends. And sometimes you're going to, what do they call it modernly, hook up. And sometimes you're going to get married. You're going to have a sister-in-law over there, and they're going to have a brother-in-law over here. So that we begin cultivating a population which is genuinely anti-war international. The effect would be friends and sisters-in-law in the enemy countries, cities, deterring both war. One of the things that I would find interesting, it just occurred to me last night, I've only been thinking about this presentation, parts of 2 days. What do you do about ecumenicism? Well, nothing is really happening. Every religion that's dogma-dominated is probably a little embarrassed and ashamed about being so damned arbitrary, and doesn't really welcome preachers or rabbis or Islamic clerics from other contrary religions. Well, how about this? How about in this context of the war-deterring brother and sister cities thing, on a monthly basis, have preachers or priests or Islamic clerics or rabbis from a contrary religion come in and speak at the religion that's contrary and have a discussion, a talk and discussion event, say once a month. I wonder what even Pope Francis would say about that. One thing my daughter started in the New York Times, she's a New York Times person, now the deputy editor of the health section, of the science section that comes out every Tuesday, and health editor. She proposed in a story in the New York Times in New York City that, hey, people don't have public toilets. You can't go into a hotel. They won't let you use their toilet. What do? You need to pee, etc. Well, consequent from that, New York City has a long history of failing in the operation of. Obviously, you've got people who are going to go sleep in the toilets. You've got people who are going to leave messes there. How do you do it? And it's very expensive. You set up a public toilet in a square in New York City. It costs a lot of money. It has to be maintained. Well, it's not a simple question, but it's an old one that I've never heard raised in Austin. I've stopped going downtown, haven't you? I mean, where the hell do you park? So how about what they do in Boston? Underground parking. Costs a lot of money, but if the developers from California are going to ruin Austin, if we don't do it, let's do it. A city law defining when a neighborhood or the council has made a zoning decision, which, when disregarded or violated by developers, is a crime. What happens apparently now, from what I've learned in the subject in a recent controversy, indirectly, but directly from the West Austin Neighborhood Newsletter, is that, the city, all the planners, all the conferences, and they agree on this, and developers don't do it. How about a city law requiring that before any proposal to convert and to privatize, to convert any public service or publicly owned land or facility to private provision or property, there first must be a formal public debate followed by discussion, or else decision by a referendum election. Our university and college faculties, as a resource for the adults in the cities they live and work in, could be providing ongoing free public lectures and lab programs for adult citizens. Why don't we call on them? They're getting all this government money, and they're screwing the students with loan programs that are actually criminally opposed to higher education and any other kind of post-secondary education. Let's get something back. Anyhow, the learning programs from the cities that host them. It reminds me of John Silver, a historically very controversial professor of philosophy. When he was a professor of philosophy over at UT, he used to get his students an assignment to go interview slumlords. Well, let's get a little action from the universities back to the city. I have a long and elaborate program. I only have 5 minutes more, which I won't describe to you, therefore, but it is still pending as a possible program. And that is an American Union of member-controlled debate societies in every big city. Well, you can start that here in Austin with the university debate. I've already discussed it some with the debates coaches at UT. An Austin debate union, member control that chooses its own debate subjects, has a monthly debate, and it's open to the public. You could divide the public here this way, and at the end of it, you do it like you do at the Oxford Union, half for one side, the other half for one side, counted and announced who wins the debate. But it's not to win it, it's to have serious consideration of the issues we don't get in the media. The question of people locked up in Austin, it's our business, we're citizens, and the whole question of criminal justice. Well, there used to be visitation programs where concerned citizens, some of them church-based, would go into the prisons and pray with and consult with and, as it were, comfort the prisoners. I don't think that exists anymore. We need studies of the quality and reality of incarceration programs in the city of Austin at whatever level of government. We need a welcome back program where people greet these people when they come back out, some of them alone, some of them totally broke, totally discredited by their records with no prospect of job. We need a welcome back program and a brothers and sisters program for some. In the last 5 minutes I have, I'm going to read you 2 lists. Topics for or census of adequacies of present elements of social programs in Austin, : neighborhood gardens, befrienders, for desperate persons, rides for the stranded, poor, and sick, senior centers, leftover food centers. How adequate and how independent is civilian supervision and control of the police? Same question for the county. Census continues. Regulation and control of lobbying to the city council, criminalizing favored special access to an official in provable exchange for campaign gifts, thereby constituting acts of bribery. That, I think, is the national solution to the lobbyists in Washington. Why not in Austin? Start it here. Facilities and physicians for the mentally ill, the foster home care situation, access of the poor, including the homeless, to cultural events and adult education, to the extent you can, overcoming the deep class prejudice that apparently undereducated don't need high culture. Farm to kitchen arrangements and eat local programs. I can give you the email for one of them in around Texas, around Austin, if you want it. Spring through fall, open air, free public series music. Second list. Yeah, I'm staying in. Possible topics, easy for citizen and study action groups, if we had them. Bond financing as interest rates go back up versus city taxation. Facilities to protect the homeless, the poor, the desperate, the sick. Are the churches doing enough? Public showers and bathrooms. Why don't we just have some? I don't mean, well, because when you get into private homes, you get into the problem of safety. The safety of the family, the safety of the children. Why not a homeless qualified as safe and responsible guest list for consideration for private homes and barns? A homeless jobs register and rides. An entertainment, educational, and games center comparable to the senior care center for the homeless, the poor, and the desperate. Democracy as a verb, study and action groups. A group that looks at how we vote. This first past the post, majority wins situation. This franchises effectively who doesn't win. So proportional representation. How about a look at that for Austin? First past the post, not. Bottoms up budgeting as in Kerala. The key action of the legislature, the city council, the Congress is budgeting the money. And we have no participation in it if we're not representatives. In Kerala, in India, they invented from the bottom up budgeting. Citizens met, like here are comparable to be in precincts or in neighborhoods. And you start with the budgeting. I mean, what do you think about $330 billion in the next 10 years for nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines and new bombers and so forth? And it goes up, in the Austin case, to the city council from the citizens. Perhaps as citizens, we should all think about personally being citizens, as persons rather, not just consumers, voters, taxpayers, workers, employers, employees, entrepreneurs, and politicians. Thank you. Okay.
And now we'll take some questions.
Yes, I actually a small comment. You're making an excellent discussion of nuclear weapons, something we haven't heard of for a while. But I want to tell you that I basically started speaking out on it and doing a lot of speaking everywhere. And back in 1984, when Reagan came out with this Strategic Defense Initiative, and so I started speaking everywhere in the U.S. and even several places in Europe on how SDI would make the arms race accelerate. It's something we do not need. And I finally got a book out on it, and it was profiled in Contemporary Authors in '92. But these days, there's still people in the military claiming we want a defensive. The United States needs to develop a defense against nuclear weapons. But developing a defense against nuclear weapons could still accelerate the arms race. It's just something we don't want.
Okay. Ronnie?
That is what destroyed the destruction of nuclear weapons between Gorbachev and Reagan. They were on the way to agreeing to complete nuclear disarmament. You remember Reagan said a nuclear war cannot be fought and should not be fought and can't be won. But there was somebody in Reykjavik who lied to Reagan And the SDI, the Strategic Defensive Initiative, became the block over which Reagan and Gorbachev failed to agree. And that resulted in the new nuclear arms race we're in now between Putin and, I'm sorry to say it, despite his promise to seek a world free of nuclear weapons of Obama. The key logical problem, which as citizens of the world, we need a new chapter of World Citizens Party of Austin to match our group in Cambridge that we formed in 2004. The key problem, if you can see it straight instead of nationalistically, is that if you can stop nuclear weapons from coming in to us and bombing us, that's a first strike initiative. We have the first strike power. Nobody can stop us from first strike because we're not in any danger. That, of course, Gorbachev saw vividly and they couldn't agree because somebody lied to Reagan. I don't know who, but I sure want to find out.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Mr. Dugger.
It's an honor to be here, sir.
Been very impressed by the work you've done from the Observer and forward. So, my question centers around what I think is an incredible insight you have with respect to the power of cities. Go back to Jane Jacobs and others who recognized this maybe half a century ago.
Yeah.
But the issue here is we have seen over the last 50 years the essentially very well orchestrated takeover of control of this country by a very small group of wealth that has propagandized and organized against it.
They're governing.
The city and the approach you have, I think, is the opposite of that. That program we frequently trace back to what was called the Powell Memo that outlined setting up organizations like the Enterprise Organization, Manhattan, and others to go forward and take over control of the thoughts and the government. Yours sounds like the Dugger Memo, which has elements of how one, or at least the cities, rather than the wealth in individual hands, may be able to take over the control or take back the control that we thought we were getting in the 60s and early 70s. So I would submit that the Dugger Memo is a start in opposing the Powell.
You motivate me to write the Dugger Memo, but it seems to me that there's only one part that I would differ from what you said, and that is that we can control through the cities. It's self-government at the federal level, where every aggregated entity governs itself. It's not trying to control anybody else. And the federal government, in the postulation of a world federation of the nations that we are working for now out of Boston and other countries, we want a world parliament. We want an abolition of the veto to start. That's just starting as a movement. Well, that's not an attempt to control, except self-govern. And in that context, we're all offset by the requirement of civil liberties, by not getting so greedy that you basically become the government, like what Senator Sanders is calling the billionaire class has. Not being international corporations that fundamentally take over the government, the right to govern, as they're doing in the pending, about to be fast-tracked international trade agreement, the salient thing of which has nothing to do with tariffs. It has to do with setting up courts of corporate lawyers, lobbyists, who will decide that our Clean Air Act violates how much profit their corporations can make and fine us for it. In other words, they're taking away government with these so-called fast-tracked, undebated, congressionally passed, congressionally bought trade agreements. So-called trade agreements. They're not. They're transfer of sovereignty agreements. Yeah. So anyhow, I'm with you, and I do see Wiley's book is really worth reading, called Save Thyself, though it's perhaps not too clearly put, but it's the idea of cities as an effective governing counterforce against corporate-dominated nations and billionaire class-dominated rich people.
I'm so glad that you brought up the issue of nuclear weapons again. You hear very little about it in the press today. A couple comments. The weapons that were dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in the range of tens of kilotons, 10,000 tons of TNT.
13.
the current weapons are in 1 to 10 megaton range, 100 to 1,000 times as strong.
Right.
And in the spread of nuclear weapons continues. In addition to the 5 countries, I think it was U.S., Russia, China, France, and England.
Right.
I think I'd add now Pakistan, India, North Korea, Israel, of course.
Yeah.
And there's probably other ones I don't know about.
That's it. That's all we know about.
Question to you is, where do you think the potential flashpoint is in terms of countries where it's most dangerous in terms of sparking a nuclear war?
Well, Eric Schlosser is certainly the best published writer on accidental episodes from which we have barely escaped. You think, of course, of the 1962 missile crisis. Remember, Robert Kennedy said he went home from the White House one night during that crisis, about I don't remember how many days, and he said to his wife, "I don't know if we're going to see each other in the morning." That's how close it was and how bad. It was just a guesswork, and if Khrushchev had not turned that boat back, President Johnson told me when I interviewed him in the White House, no, I reminded him that he had told us when I interviewed him in the White House that in the first 30 minutes of a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, at that time, 40 million Americans would die. This is what we're talking about. But we're not talking about it anymore. It's like it's not even an issue. Our members of Congress don't even discuss it. Well, as citizens, that's our fault. That's all I'm saying. Yes, sir. It's hell on earth, and it's damn close. It's getting worse because of nuclear proliferation. One of the 3 co-inventors of the nuclear bomb, of the hydrogen bomb, Richard Garwin, who was, I think, at that time in IBM laboratories, he invented it with a Harvard character and Edward Teller, told me when I asked him, in the time you were starting in your nuclear work, how they felt, those guys who were making the bomb. What was their thinking about what they were doing? I thought he might walk out, but he didn't. He was very quiet. Maybe a minute passed. He said, what we're doing with nuclear deterrence, the theory that justifies what we're doing, everybody having nuclear weapons against each other, is buying time. We're not going to be able to stop nuclear proliferation. Darwin told me this. I published it in the Dallas News finally after all those years because I didn't see it was so hopeless I didn't want to spread it. I'm afraid I didn't act very journalistically. He said, no, we're not going to stop nuclear proliferation. There is going to be a nuclear war and 1 billion people.
To comment, first of all, Ronnie, I want to thank you for coming back to Austin.
Good to see you again.
Thank you, and sharing yourself with us and your ideas. Ideas are in short supply in this country.
They are.
And that's why what you've said today is very precious. And also I want to thank you for talking about the city of Austin, which I guess if there weren't an Athens, Texas, we could call ourselves the Athens of Texas. But I guess we just have to settle ourselves with the city of Austin. And so I think we need to start fighting back. You know, the governor has already fired the first shot. He wants to ban our plastic bag ban. And no one has commented on the fact that what that plastic essentially does is goes to the oceans and kills all the fish, which is happening right now.
But would you tell me a little more about what you said about Austin Special? I didn't quite get that.
Well, I said we have a duty to the people of Texas to educate them and have you come forward, and we have a duty to the state of Texas and ourselves to try to live a decent, God-fearing, common-sense life, even if we do live in Texas. So we appreciate you coming back to Austin to lead that fight. Thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for that enormous compliment to Austin, but I'd rather you reformulate it that we Texans have a duty to educate each other. I'm afraid we don't want to go out to, I don't know, East Texas and out there in Shafter, a silver mining town where my dad was born, because he was a saloon keeper. We don't want to go out there and say, we're down here to educate you. I don't think they'd take it too good. But you're right. Let's get going.
Ronnie, I have a kind of combined question and statement. I know that Denton, I believed, passed an ordinance banning fracking or something along those lines and showing some political muscle, and I don't know what the ultimate outcome of that will be. One of my major concerns is ensuring that we have good community policing in Austin, and you mentioned having a citizens task force on police use of force, etc., and I think that's a idea whose time has definitely come.
Well, what is the status of, there's probably some citizen participation in monitoring the police. What is the condition of that in Austin?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm up to the moment on that. There is a citizens review panel, I believe.
Like that.
And, of course, we do have a police monitor, Margot Frazier, who spoke here at the forum. But I think that their power is limited, and I would like to see a review, a reexamination of how to structure all of that so we can have
census.
Independent investigations of use of force.
Yes, I would too. And of course, did you all hear Obama's magnificent speech at the bridge in Alabama? It was magnificent. I was very moved. Yeah, one of the best speeches I ever heard by anybody, and maybe the best speech of his presidency. Anyway, we've had too much citizen violence. We got cops on trial here, and the worst thing seems to have been that the federal government, with no sign from Congress, no sign from Austin, has militarized the police. They've got these battlefield weapons. For God's sakes, Well, I certainly think you're right. The key question is, as you can see from the Harvest from My Poor Mind, there's so many things that need doing. Nothing is being done really, except zoning, maybe at the city level, and that's where the people are. We've got 5 liberal cities in Texas. They are now electing our progressive candidates, except the Hispanics don't turn out. Why not? Because the state denied them $1 million worth of taxes we've already paid for their Medicaid. Not just the Hispanics, but the poor whites. So unless we get on the tail of our own politicians, we're not going to matter. And I really do think I'm going to say something really pessimistic, and I'm sorry to do it, but the country is breaking down as a fair and a good place. The state is rot gut in the United States. It is the principal negative influence on the social responsibility of the United States government, which is the principal negative influence on the militarization of outcomes in the human race. So really the human race is at risk here in our time. So we should, I think, maybe start talking about remedies. Have we run out of time, dear?
No, we still have, about 14 minutes? So I know there are more questions and statements out here. Okay. Our camera person, Becky Halpin, wants to say something.
Y'all sure have this well managed.
Becky.
Thank you, Ronnie. So speaking of Andrews County and the potential for dragging nuclear fuel rods, spent fuel rods there from all across the country, now we see these exploding oil train bombs going off in Canada and the United States. The idea of bringing in spent fuel rods, on thousands of different trucks from all parts of the country, and even the idea of terrorism, if not just plain old accident. What do you have to say? And then burying them in dirt, just dirt, out there in Andrews County. It doesn't seem very thought out to me.
I think your observation, which I regard as correct to the extent they let us know anything about such matters, including nuclear extermination of the human race, is it's comparable to some other situations where we're fundamentally being lied to. One of the things they tell us is, and they teach us is, that, and they teach it in school, and they teach it in politics, and they teach it in U.S. Senate races, everywhere they teach us, if they're running for office, because they don't want to go up against what we now call the deep secret government and the military state. They tell us that deterrence and nuclear weapons are protecting us. Well, that's a lie. Nuclear weapons are endangering everybody who has them, because then terrorists aim at us, because then other nuclear nations and we can get into fights which could escalate into the destruction of the human race and nuclear winter, where there wouldn't be enough food for people to eat all around the world. So that's a lie. It's a lie in a sense. It's an ethical lie. It's defensible as a position. It's just an opinion about what will happen if such and so is done. But as Garwin told me, all we're doing is buying time. But after all, we shouldn't have to buy our own time as a species. Now, on that matter of nuclear waste, when I was editing the Texas Observer, as I did for about 8 years after starting it, Susan wrote a piece about nuclear waste for Texas, in which at that early stage of the information, she taught our readers that the problem was this nuclear waste remains deadly for 10,000 years. I thought that was a wonderful piece of journalism. Nobody ever else had published that one. And so the Observer published that. And subsequently, a federal judge dealing with all the data about the nuclear waste repositories for the United States agreed in sending it back down for the retrial of a case, I think it was, that it would have to be secure enough to protect the population from it for 1 million years. Now, who was lying to us? The government was lying to us. The government used to put out, and did as late as, in my opinion, as 1977, and I have one because I got one at the time, or in the 80s maybe, the effects of nuclear weapons. Well, it's really hard to read. You've got to be almost a scientist to understand most of it. But then you come upon little facts like this. When a nuclear bomb goes off, in the first 1/100th or 1,000th of a second, the temperature exceeds the heat of the center of the sun. That's what we're dealing with. It's still here. And it's become, and Putin is now saying, I can use nuclear weapons for strategic reasons of my nation. Well, he's, of course, a dictator. So is President Obama, a dictator of the foreign and military policy of the United States. Well, there's so much there that we're ignorant of. If some of us formed one of these Swedish study and action groups, I'd want to explore the way the conscience of the American people is basically undisturbed by the known doctrine, what we would do if we came under nuclear attack. Our doctrine is retaliation. The theory of deterrence, perhaps you haven't ever been asked to think about it. We have nuclear weapons, and we're going to spend $1 trillion in the course of getting a nuclear-free world in the next 30 years, empowering better nuclear weapons. Actually, the doctrine that I got out of the Los Alamos scientists in Los Alamos, we're making the weapons smaller so they're more usable. That's what we're doing. In part, they're more usable. The more usable idea. Sure.
Brother Dugger, all right. Now,
all right,
you've told us a lot of the sad story that we've gotten ourselves into. And you mentioned fleetingly remedies. And one of the things you're skirting the edges of here is the kind of inspiration of the free spirit, of the American spirit, of the founding of democracy. Now, if you could give us a little bit of your wit and wisdom here on those kinds of values and those kinds of energies, maybe we might be able to have a dialogue about how we can make things better with tapping into those kinds of qualities.
Chomsky is a very argumentative man, and I always have a little difficulty distinguishing what Noam Chomsky is presenting as facts or interpretation, but he's the source and a reliable source. He's reliable about facts. Of this fact, James Madison said about 1816, plus or minus a few years, whatever my memory would fail to have exactly. And of course, he had a ranch of 5,000 slaves. James Madison, the father of American constitutionalism, the only man who kept full records of the 4 months of writing the Constitution. He has 5,000 slaves. Washington freed his slaves before he died, but Jefferson didn't. Jefferson was actually so expensive. He loved French wines and things he imported from Europe, and he had 101 or 105 slaves. They made nails for him, and it. That's where the money came from for his perfection of Monticello. So in that situation, the people like Madison knew that the system they had created protected property and didn't end slavery. They knew they hadn't quite succeeded. Furthermore, they had totally violated their promise as elected delegates to reform the Confederation. They formed a federation. So they were not exactly unpolitical. And I love it in a recent book about Lincoln that postulates the idea that when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and so forth, he regarded what Jefferson had done in the Declaration of Independence, that all men, of course not women, all men were created equal. He was thinking ahead to the solution of slavery they couldn't achieve. Well, what Chomsky quotes Madison as saying, Richard, is, I haven't got it verbatim, but boy, I sure have the content of verbatim. Well, the system we have built will end up under the ownership and control of a few citizens. Now, first, let's just stop. The man who wrote the Constitution, at the time he had 5,000 slaves, owned them. After 25 years, or 20 years, said about that system, it's going to wind up owned by a few people and controlled by a few people. And then it will be up to the better or the best people. I think he said the better people to fix it. So, Richard, I'm not looking to the founders of the American oligarchy. Sanders is using the term oligarchy now. But what is oligarchy? Oligarchy is controlled by a few, isn't it? And that is to say, it's control of the government by the rich. It's the government plus the rich. That's exactly where we are. The problem is that when you add force against critics, you got fascism. We're one element short of that. Nader, whom I made, I think, the political mistake of endorsing and helping when he was running for president, because it gave us our George W. Bush war in Iraq. So I share, and all of us who did Nader share moral responsibility to whatever extent we had effect. What, 2 million dead? That's what we're dealing with now. And we're here alone in a beautiful, open-minded, free-minded church that is beautiful for its ethical reverence. But each one of us, I mean, I probably have more moral duty for my moral failures than any one of you. I certainly hope nobody here has that much. So it's a question of each one of us, Richard, starting a new system. I remember I started the Alliance for Democracy, and one of the things I said, one of my screeds for it, was that the issue is not the issues, the issue is the system. And that's true now. And I think the issue is, in part, what happened to free enterprise. Free enterprise, I deeply believe, as a working social economic system, in competitive free enterprise. Believe in it. It's mine. My way of life. Otherwise, you get freeloaders. You get monopoly. But we don't have free enterprise anymore. We have what I regard as the second system, the second American system, and that's monopoly capital and banks as thugs who invent fees you suddenly find in the 6 point of your banking account. So what's happened is the whole first system, which was competitive, has been succeeded in terms of who has power and the real money by monopoly corporations, transnational congeries of interacting corporations, and oligopolies. So that what we actually have is not free enterprise anymore. So we have to fix the system. Well, we ain't going to do that except one at a time, coming from such a chapel as this. Too big a job.
You were talking about nuclear devastation, actually.
Yeah.
All we have to do is look at Fukushima, and this is not a nuclear bomb. This is just a simple accident from a tidal wave, and to look at the devastation of the people from probably hundreds of miles from that site, not even counting the ocean that is polluted, the fish that cannot be eaten, the crops that cannot be grown. So, yet we don't really hear much about it now. After the initial phase, we don't really realize what nuclear devastation could be like, and yet we have examples of it that we could be looking at and we could be reporting on right now.
Well, and look at the story that President Truman and many other people aping him put out, that we had to nuclear bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because if we didn't, we would lose 1 million men in the invasion. The first figure that General Marshall put out, that, well, if we invaded Japan, we'd lose 50,000 men. That went to 1 million, and it became the post-war lie to keep us quiet as citizens, because we're the ones endangered too. But the thing that went on about it was the idea that we had to invade. Japan had no navy left. They had no airplanes. They had no food. They were an island. We were surrounding them. Russia came into the war. There was no need to use those damn bombs. And there's very good evidence that Truman used them because Jim Burns, his Secretary of State then, and he didn't want Russia to enter the war. They were trying to end the war before Russia entered it. Well, they didn't, but it was about simultaneous. So basically, I remember this. Please, we got 1 more minute. I'll tell you about something I learned from Garo Perovitz. For about 50 years, he was professionally the revisionist on the history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He wrote a series of books about that. And in the footnote on page 81 of one of those books, he quoted Henry Wallace's minutes of the meeting of Truman's cabinet after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the issue was whether to drop a third bomb. And Truman said, no, all those kids. Now that tells you what he really knew, thought, and felt, and died with it. But our national honor was involved, because if we had murdered 100,000 people who didn't need to be murdered, where was our national honor? Well, where is it? We are now, our military now exceeds in power and volume the next closest 9 other nations. No, we got a lot to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. This is a call to action, and I think we're inspired and energized. Thanks again.